Today, you're going to be working with independent and dependent variables. The important thing to remember about this is that the x is always independent. The x is always independent. The x is always independent. The y is always dependent. The y is always dependent. The y is always dependent. Remember, on a table, the x always comes first and then the y. You will be asked to identify or list the independent and dependent values. If you are asked to list the independent values, you're going to be looking at the top where the x is because the x is always independent. So the independent values are 0, 1, 2, and 3. If you are asked to list the dependent values, you are looking at the bottom or the y, the dependent. That would be 10, 11, 12, and 13. When looking at a graph, remember that this is always the x-axis and this is always the y-axis. So when we're talking about independent and dependent variables on a graph, the bottom is going to be our independent variable because it goes with the x. And remember, x is always independent. The side over here is going to be our dependent because it goes with the y. And remember, the y is always dependent. So you may be asked to list the independent or dependent values graphed. So if we're asked to list the independent values graphed, we're looking at the x's. We're looking at the x values for each of these points. So our first point has an x value of 1. So our first number would be 1. Our second point has an x value of 2. And then 3. And then 4. And then 5. So those are our independent values. If we're looking for the dependent values, we would go to the left side and we would look at the y values of each of these points. Don't forget, the x is always independent and the y is always dependent.